That child was a mistake, Daniel Carter said, standing at the foot of the hospital bed as if he were reviewing a contract instead of looking at his wife and newborn son. And for a moment, nothing in the room moved, not the pale afternoon light filtering through the blinds, not the slow drip of fluid through the four-line, not even Emily Carter, who lay still against the raised pillows with her hands resting loosely at her sides, her body still recovering from a C-section performed less than 72 hours earlier. The sharp, sterile scent of antiseptic hanging in the air, blending with the faint warmth of plastic and linen, the kind of smell that never quite leaves a hospital no matter how clean it is, the baby sleeping quietly in the bassinet beside her, wrapped in a thin striped blanket, his small chest rising and falling in steady, fragile rhythm, unaware of the sentence that had just been placed over his life. And Daniel didn't look at him, not once, his gaze fixed somewhere just above Emily's shoulder, detached, composed, like he had already stepped out of the room in his mind. And Emily didn't speak, didn't ask what he meant, didn't argue or cry, because something inside her had already gone still, not broken, not yet, just quiet in a way that felt deliberate, as if her body had decided that reacting too soon would be a mistake of its own. And the only sound between them was the faint beeping of the monitor tracking her heart rate, steady, controlled, almost indifferent. And Daniel exhaled softly, like a man relieved to have said what needed to be said, then added, "We weren't ready for this." His tone even measured, as though readiness were something that could be scheduled and adjusted like a meeting. And Emily turned her head just slightly toward the bassinet, watching the baby's tiny fingers curl and uncurl in sleep, the movement slow and instinctive, and she noticed the detail she might have missed before, the faint crease near his wrist, the soft, uneven rhythm of his breathing, the way his face relaxed completely when undisturbed. And behind her, footsteps passed in the hallway, rubber soles against polished tile, distant voices rising and falling, life continuing outside the room without interruption. And Daniel shifted his weight, glancing briefly at his watch, a small, almost invisible gesture that carried more weight than anything else he had said. And still, he didn't look at the child. And Emily understood something then, not all at once, not dramatically, but in a slow, precise way that settled into her chest like a fact she could not ignore. That this moment was not about shock or anger or even loss. Not yet. It was about clarity, about seeing exactly who he was when it mattered most. And she nodded once, not in agreement, not in acceptance, just acknowledgement. And Daniel seemed to take that as enough, as closure, as permission to leave the conversation exactly where he had placed it. And when he turned toward the door, his steps were quiet, almost careful, like he didn't want to disturb anything further. And the door clicked shut behind him with a soft, controlled sound, leaving the room exactly as it had been before he spoke, except that it wasn't the same anymore. And Emily remained still for a long moment, her eyes on the bassinet, her breathing steady, her expression calm. And when she finally moved, it was slow, deliberate, her hand reaching toward the baby, resting lightly against the edge of the blanket, not lifting him yet, just feeling the presence of him there, real, undeniable. And in the silence that followed, there was no anger, no tears, just a quiet, unmistakable understanding that whatever Daniel had decided in that moment, whatever he believed about their child, he didn't yet understand what he had just set into motion. Daniel did not come back that evening, and he did not call, not when the sun went down behind the hospital parking lot, not when the hallway lights dimmed to that softer nighttime setting that made everything feel quieter than it really was, and not even when a nurse stepped in around 9 o'clock to check Emily's vitals and asked, in a gentle voice that had clearly asked this question many times before, "Will your husband be staying the night?" And Emily simply shook her head once, calm, controlled, as if the answer had already been decided long before anyone thought to ask. And the nurse did not press, just nodded and adjusted the thin blanket over Emily's legs before moving to the bassinet, where the baby had begun to stir, making small, uncertain sounds that filled the room more than any words could. And Emily watched as the nurse carefully lifted him, checked his temperature, then placed him back down with practiced ease. And when the nurse left, the room settled again into that same quiet rhythm, the hum of the air system, the faint beeping of machines, the distant echo of footsteps in the corridor. And Emily turned her head slightly, studying her son with the same steady attention she had shown since Daniel walked out, not searching for answers, not trying to make sense of what had been said, just observing, taking in details, the curve of his cheek, the way his tiny hand rested against the blanket, the soft rise and fall of his chest. And for the first time since the surgery, she shifted her weight carefully, ignoring the pull of the incision, and reached out, lifting him slowly into her arms, holding him close enough to feel the warmth of his skin through the thin hospital gown. And he settled almost immediately, his breathing evening out, as if he recognized something familiar in her presence, and Emily did not smile, but her expression changed in a way that was almost imperceptible, something softer beneath the surface, something certain, and she sat like that for a long time, the hours passing without urgency until the window reflected only the dim interior lights and her own silhouette holding the child, and sometime after midnight, she reached for her phone, the screen lighting up the quiet room with a pale glow, and she scrolled through her contacts once, then stopped at a single name, Rachel Monroe, and for a moment, her thumb hovered over the call button, not hesitating out of doubt but out of calculation, as if she were measuring the exact moment something shifted from one life into another, and then she pressed it, and Rachel answered on the second ring, her voice alert despite the late hour. "Emily, is everything okay?" And there was a brief pause, just enough for Emily to choose her words, and when she spoke, her voice was low, even completely steady. "He left." Another pause, longer this time, and Rachel did not ask for clarification, did not fill the silence with questions. She simply said, "Do you need me there?" And Emily looked down at the baby in her arms, his fingers curling lightly against her gown, and she replied, "Yes, but not here." And Rachel exhaled softly, understanding more than Emily had said out loud. "Give me an hour," she said, and the line went quiet. And Emily placed the phone back on the tray beside her bed, her movements slow, deliberate, and she did not rush, did not panic, did not try to piece together what Daniel might do next or what he had meant beyond the words he had already spoken, because in that moment, none of that mattered. What mattered was what she had seen clearly, without confusion, without denial, and she leaned back slightly against the pillows, adjusting her hold on the baby, and whispered, so quietly it barely broke the silence, "You are not a mistake." Not as reassurance, not as comfort, but as a statement of fact, and the room remained still, holding that truth without argument, without resistance, and somewhere down the hall, a door closed softly, another monitor beeped in steady rhythm, and time moved forward the way it always did, indifferent, quiet, but carrying everything with it, whether anyone was ready or not. Rachel arrived just before 1 in the morning, moving through the hospital hallway with quiet urgency, her sneakers making soft, controlled sounds against the polished floor. And when she stepped into the room, she paused for a brief second, taking in the scene without asking questions, Emily sitting upright despite the strain, the baby resting calmly against her chest, the dim overhead light casting long shadows across the walls, and Rachel closed the door gently behind her before speaking. Her voice low, steady, "You already decided." And Emily nodded once, not looking up immediately, her attention still on the small, steady breathing of her son. And Rachel did not waste time with sympathy or shock, she moved closer, setting her bag down on the chair near the window, her eyes scanning the room, the discharge papers on the tray, the half-empty water cup, the hospital bracelet still around Emily's wrist, details that told her more than words could. "And how soon can you leave?" she asked, practical, direct, and Emily shifted slightly, the movement controlled despite the tension it caused. "Tonight," she said, and Rachel studied her for a moment, measuring the distance between what was possible and what Emily had already decided, then nodded. "Then we do it clean." And there was no drama in her tone, no hesitation, just a clear understanding that whatever had happened earlier had already crossed a line that could not be undone. And Emily carefully placed the baby back into the bassinet, her movements slow, deliberate, as if every second mattered in a way she could not fully explain, and she reached for the folder on the tray, flipping it open, reviewing the pages without really reading them, her eyes moving steadily across the lines of printed text, discharge instructions, follow-up appointments, guidelines that assumed a normal routine, a stable home, a support system that no longer existed in the way it had just days ago. And Rachel stepped beside her, glancing down briefly before asking, "Do you have anything at home you need tonight?" And Emily shook her head once. "No," she said, then added after a second, "Not anything that matters." And that was enough. Rachel did not press further. She simply moved with quiet efficiency, gathering the few items that were already there, the small bag by the chair, the folded blanket, the paperwork, organizing them without unnecessary motion. And Emily watched her for a moment, then looked back at her son, noticing again how calm he was, how unaffected by everything outside the small space of the bassinet. And she reached down, adjusting the edge of the blanket around him, her fingers steady, precise, and for a brief moment, Her reflection caught in the dark window, pale, composed, almost unrecognizable compared to the woman who had walked into the hospital just days before. And she did not look away. She held that reflection for a second longer, then turned back. "We leave before morning," she said quietly, and Rachel nodded. "Good." And there was a pause, not empty but full of understanding, the kind that did not need to be spoken out loud, and somewhere down the hall, a cart rolled past, wheels clicking softly against the seams in the floor. A distant voice calling out a room number, the world continuing at its usual pace, and Emily lifted her son again, holding him closer this time, not for comfort, not for reassurance, but because it felt like the right thing to do, and as she adjusted her grip, the baby stirred slightly, his eyes opening for just a moment before settling again. And Emily noticed that too, the brief flicker of awareness, the quiet presence of life that did not ask for permission to exist, and she leaned back slightly, steadying herself, her voice barely above a whisper. "He will come back." And Rachel looked at her, not questioning the statement, just acknowledging it, and Emily's gaze did not shift, her focus fixed on the child in her arms. "But not for the reason he thinks." And the room fell silent again, not heavy, not uncertain, just still, as if everything that needed to be decided had already been set into motion. And outside, the first faint hint of early morning began to touch the edges of the sky, unnoticed by most, but moving forward all the same. They left before the hospital fully woke up, before the morning shift changed and the hallways filled with voices and rolling carts, before anyone had the chance to ask questions that required answers Emily was not interested in giving. And the air outside felt colder than it had the night before, sharper, carrying that early morning stillness that made everything seem suspended for just a moment longer. And Rachel moved first, opening the passenger door of her car while Emily stepped carefully down from the curb, one hand steadying herself against the door frame, the other holding her son close against her chest, wrapped securely in the hospital blanket, his small face barely visible beneath the fabric, and neither of them spoke as they settled into their seats, the quiet between them not empty but focused, deliberate, like everything else they had done since Rachel arrived. And when the engine started, the low hum filled the space, grounding the moment in something real, something moving forward, and the hospital building faded behind them in the rearview mirror, its windows reflecting the faint gray of dawn, and Emily did not look back, not once, her gaze fixed ahead, her posture still, controlled, as if she had already drawn a line between what was behind her and what was not worth revisiting, and the roads were mostly empty, just a few headlights passing in the opposite direction, a delivery truck turning slowly at an intersection, the quiet rhythm of a city not yet fully awake. And after several minutes Rachel spoke, her voice calm, measured, "I have a place." And Emily turned her head slightly, just enough to acknowledge the words without breaking the stillness she held. "Where?" she asked, and Rachel kept her eyes on the road. "Lincoln Park, small condo, it is mine, no one checks, no one asks." And Emily nodded once, accepting the information, without needing more, because details would come later. What mattered now was movement, distance, separation from the version of her life that had ended the moment Daniel chose his words and walked away. And the baby shifted slightly in her arms, making a soft sound that drew her attention downward, and she adjusted the blanket with careful precision, her movement steady despite the lingering pain that she did not acknowledge out loud. And Rachel glanced over briefly, not out of concern but out of confirmation. "You are going to need rest," she said, and Emily's response came without hesitation, "Later." And there was something final in that word, not dismissive, not careless, just clear, as if rest belonged to a different time, one that had not arrived yet. And the car continued through quiet streets, past rows of houses still dark, storefronts with lights just beginning to flicker on, the world preparing to start another day without knowing anything had changed for the woman sitting in the passenger seat. And after a while, Rachel turned onto a narrower street lined with older buildings, slowing as she pulled into a small parking lot behind a brick structure that looked unremarkable, in a way that felt intentional, and she cut the engine, the sudden silence settling around them again, and for a moment neither of them moved, not out of hesitation but because the shift from movement to stillness required a different kind of control. And then Rachel stepped out, moving around to open Emily's door, offering a steady hand without making it a gesture of concern, just support where it was needed, and Emily accepted it without comment, stepping out carefully, holding her son securely, and together they moved toward the building, the early morning air brushing against their faces, cool and clean. And inside, the hallway was quiet, the lights dim but steady, and Rachel unlocked the door to the condo with a small click, pushing it open to reveal a simple space, clean, organized, prepared in a way that suggested it had always been meant for something like this, and Emily stepped inside, her eyes taking in the room in a single measured sweep, the couch, the small kitchen, the window letting in the first pale light of morning, and she moved toward the center of the space, stopping there as if marking a new starting point, and when she finally spoke, her voice was low, controlled. "He thinks this ends here." And Rachel closed the door behind them, locking it without a sound, and Emily looked down at her son, her expression unchanged but her focus sharper, more defined. But this is where it begins. And outside, the city continued waking up, unaware that somewhere inside a quiet building, a decision had already been made that would not be undone. The first few days passed without any announcement, without any dramatic shift that marked a new beginning, just a quiet sequence of hours measured by feeding times, the soft rhythm of the baby's breathing, and the steady, controlled movements Emily made as she adjusted to a space that was not hers but would have to be enough for now. And the condo remained still, insulated from the outside world in a way that made everything feel both temporary and intentional. And Rachel kept her distance in a precise way, present when needed, absent when not, moving through the space with quiet efficiency, leaving meals on the counter, keeping calls short, never asking questions that would require Emily to revisit anything she had already decided to leave behind. And Emily did not turn on the television, did not check the news, did not scroll through messages or missed calls, because there were already several, Daniel's name appearing more than once on her phone screen, each call spaced just far enough apart to suggest persistence without urgency, and she did not answer, not the first time, not the second, not even when a voicemail notification appeared, because whatever he had to say would come later, and later was not now, and instead she focused on what was directly in front of her, the baby in her arms, the quiet space around her, the slow rebuilding of something that did not need to be explained to anyone else yet. And by the fourth day, she was moving more steadily, the initial strain in her body still present but controlled, her steps measured, her posture straighter, as if each small movement was a deliberate reclaiming of control, and she began to establish a rhythm, not dictated by habit but by intention, waking before the baby stirred, preparing what little she needed, organizing the space in small ways that made it feel less like a temporary stop and more like a foundation. And Rachel noticed but did not comment, only watching from a distance as Emily placed a small folded blanket near the couch, arranged a few essential items on the kitchen counter. Her actions quiet but purposeful, and on the fifth morning, just as the first light slipped through the window, Emily picked up her phone again, not to check missed calls, but to open something else entirely, a secure file storage application she had not accessed in months, her fingers moving with calm precision as she entered her credentials, and the screen filled with documents organized, labeled, untouched since the last time she had reviewed them, and she did not hesitate, opening a folder marked with a date from 2 years earlier, her eyes scanning the contents with the same steady focus she had shown in the hospital room. And there were financial records, account summaries, agreements that had once been shared between her and Daniel, evidence of contributions, of decisions made behind closed doors, of a partnership that had never been as simple as it appeared on the surface, and she read through them slowly, not with urgency, not with emotion, but with clarity, as if she were confirming something she had already known but had chosen not to act on until now. And the baby stirred beside her, a soft sound pulling her attention back, and she reached over, lifting him into her arms without breaking her focus entirely, balancing both realities at once, the present and what would come next, and she whispered again, not as reassurance but as acknowledgement, "We are going to be fine." And then she closed the file, locking the screen with a small final motion, and set the phone down beside her, because the plan was not something that needed to be rushed, it was something that needed to be precise. And across the room, the early sunlight stretched further across the floor, touching the edges of the space that was slowly becoming hers, and Emily sat there, holding her son, her expression calm, her posture steady, and for the first time since she left the hospital, there was a shift, not visible, not dramatic but real, because she was no longer just reacting to what had happened, she was preparing for what would happen next. And somewhere else in the city, Daniel Carter checked his phone again, seeing no response, no message, no indication of where she had gone. And for the first time, something in that silence did not feel like control, it felt like distance, the kind that could not be easily closed. By the end of the first week, the silence between Emily and Daniel had settled into something more defined, No longer just the absence of communication but a clear boundary that neither of them had crossed, and Daniel's messages had shifted in tone, from brief calls to longer voicemails, from simple "call me back" to statements that carried a different kind of weight, explanations without context, justifications without being asked, and Emily listened to one of them only once, late at night. When the condo was completely still, the baby asleep beside her, the soft glow of her phone lighting up her face as Daniel's voice filled the quiet space, controlled at first, then slightly strained as he spoke about timing, about pressure, about how things had gotten complicated, and Emily did not react, did not interrupt, even though he could not hear her. She simply let the message play to the end, then locked the screen and placed the phone face down on the table, as if turning it over removed any remaining importance from what had been said. And the next morning, she did not listen to the others. She did not respond because she had already heard enough. And outside, the city had fully returned to its normal pace, cars moving steadily along the street below, distant sirens blending into the background, people passing by without knowing anything about the quiet decisions being made inside a small second-floor condo, and Emily had begun to extend her routine beyond the walls of that space, stepping outside for short periods of time, careful, measured walks along the block, the baby secured against her in a carrier, his small weight close enough to feel constant, grounding, and she moved slowly, not because she was uncertain, but because she was deliberate, observing everything, the rhythm of the neighborhood, the timing of foot traffic, the small details that made a place predictable, and Rachel watched this progression without comment, only once asking, "Are you planning to stay here long?" And Emily's answer came without hesitation, "Long enough." And there was something precise in the way she said it, as if time itself was part of a larger calculation, not something to be endured but something to be used. And that afternoon, Emily returned to the file she had opened before, this time going deeper, pulling up transaction histories, property documents, records that outlined the structure of everything she and Daniel had built together over the years, and her eyes moved steadily across the screen, not searching for leverage, not reacting with anger, just confirming facts, connecting details, and understanding how each piece fit into a larger system that Daniel believed he controlled. And she noticed patterns, decisions made in specific months, transfers that aligned with business expansions, investments that had been discussed casually but documented formally. And she closed one file, opened another, her movements efficient, focused, and at one point she paused, her gaze settling on a document that had not been reviewed in a long time, something signed early in their marriage, something that had seemed routine then, almost insignificant, but now carried a different weight entirely. And she read it twice, slowly, then once more, as if confirming that it still said exactly what she thought it did. And a small shift crossed her expression, not visible to anyone else but real, a quiet recognition of something Daniel had either forgotten or never fully understood. And she closed the file without comment, locking the screen again. And across the room, the baby made a soft sound, drawing her attention back, and she moved to him immediately, lifting him with steady hands, her posture unchanged, her focus returning to the present with the same control she had maintained from the beginning. And as she held him, she looked out the window, the late afternoon light stretching across the buildings outside, and her voice when she spoke was calm, almost neutral. "He still thinks this is about walking away." And she adjusted the blanket around her son with careful precision, her movements unhurried. "He does not understand what he signed." And the words settled into the quiet space without urgency, without emphasis, just a simple statement of fact. And somewhere across the city, Daniel Carter was beginning to realize that the absence of a response was not confusion, it was intention. And for the first time, the situation did not feel temporary. It felt like something that had already been set in motion long before he noticed it. Daniel stopped calling on the 8th day, not because he had nothing left to say, but because he had begun to understand that silence, when it was chosen, could not be forced open from the outside. And the shift was subtle but real. His last message shorter, more controlled, a single sentence asking where she was and when they could talk, without the explanations, without the justifications that had filled the earlier ones. And Emily noticed the change but did not react to it. She simply placed the phone back on the table after reading it, her expression unchanged, her focus already moving forward. And that morning, she dressed with more intention than she had since leaving the hospital, choosing simple, neutral clothing that allowed for movement, for presence without attention. And she secured her son into the carrier with steady hands, adjusting the straps until they felt balanced, precise. And Rachel watched from the kitchen without speaking, her posture relaxed but observant, And when Emily reached for the door, Rachel finally asked, "Where are you going?" Not as a challenge, not as concern, just as acknowledgement of a shift, and Emily paused for a fraction of a second, her hand resting on the handle. "To confirm something," she said, and the answer was enough. Rachel nodded once and did not follow, did not offer to come, because this was not something that required support, it required clarity. And outside, the air was warmer than it had been the previous days, the sun higher, the streets more active, people moving with purpose, cars lining the sidewalks, the city fully awake, and Emily walked with a steady pace, her movements controlled, each step measured not by hesitation but by intention, and she moved through familiar intersections, past buildings she recognized, until she reached a location that did not stand out to anyone else, a mid-sized office building with reflective windows and a quiet lobby, the kind of place people entered and exited without drawing attention, and she stepped inside, the cool air conditioning brushing against her skin, the faint scent of polished surfaces and paper lingering in the space, and the receptionist looked up briefly, offering a polite smile that did not linger, and Emily approached the desk with calm precision, stating her name without hesitation, and something in the way she said it, steady, certain, caused the receptionist to shift slightly, to check the system more carefully before nodding and making a call, and within minutes she was escorted to a private office, the door closing softly behind her, and the man inside stood as she entered, his expression composed, professional, but there was recognition there, not surprise, not confusion, just acknowledgement of someone he had expected to see eventually, and Emily did not sit immediately, she placed her hand lightly against the carrier, ensuring her son was secure, then looked directly at him, her voice even controlled. "I need to review everything that was signed." And the man nodded without asking why, without requesting context, as if the request itself already contained the answer, and he gestured toward the chair across from his desk, pulling a folder from a locked drawer with deliberate care, and as he set it down between them, the weight of it was not physical, it was structural, years of decisions, agreements, assumptions condensed into a single place, and Emily sat then, her posture straight, her gaze steady, and she opened the folder slowly, not rushing, not skimming, but reading line by line, her eyes moving with quiet precision across each page, and the room remained silent except for the faint turning of paper, the distant hum of the building outside the door, and as she reached the final document, she paused, just briefly, her gaze holding on a specific section, something written clearly, unambiguous, something that did not require interpretation, and she read it again, confirming what she had already understood days earlier, and when she finally looked up, her expression had not changed, but there was a clarity there now that had not been present before, something resolved, something complete, and she closed the folder with a soft, controlled motion, sliding it back across the desk. "Thank you," she said simply, and the man nodded, not asking what she would do next, because whatever came after this was no longer uncertain, it was already in motion, and as Emily stood adjusting the carrier against her chest, her son stirring slightly before settling again, she moved toward the door without hesitation, and outside, the city continued as it always did, unaware that somewhere within it, a decision had just been confirmed that would eventually change everything. Daniel Carter believed he understood. Emily did not return to the condo immediately after leaving the office, she walked for a while instead, not aimlessly, not uncertain, but with a steady, measured pace that allowed everything she had just confirmed to settle into place, the folder no longer in her hands but its contents clear in her mind, each clause, each signature, each assumption Daniel had made without fully understanding its reach, and the city moved around her without interruption, people passing by, conversations overlapping in fragments, the distant sound of traffic building as the day progressed, but none of it touched her focus, and when she finally stopped, it was in front of a small cafe on the corner of a quieter street, the kind of place that did not draw attention, and she stepped inside, the soft chime of the door barely noticeable as it closed behind her, the scent of coffee and warm bread filling the air, and she ordered without hesitation, her voice calm, her tone even, then moved to a table near the window where the light came in clean and steady, placing her son carefully in the carrier beside her, adjusting the blanket with the same precise movements she had used since the hospital, and for a moment she simply sat, not thinking about what had already happened, not anticipating what would come next, just allowing the present to exist without pressure, and when her phone vibrated against the table, the sound was subtle but unmistakable, and she looked at the screen. Daniel's name appearing again, but this time there was no sequence of missed calls before it, no pattern, just a single attempt, as if he had recalibrated his approach, and she let it ring once, twice, then answered, her voice steady when she spoke. "Emily," Daniel said immediately, his tone controlled but carrying an edge that had not been there before, something closer to urgency though still restrained. "Where are you?" And she did not respond to the question, not directly. Instead she adjusted the edge of the blanket around her son, her gaze steady on the small movement of his hand. "What do you need?" she asked, and there was a brief pause on the other end, not silence but recalculation, Daniel shifting from assumption to strategy. "We need to talk," he said, and Emily's response came without delay. "We are talking." And again a pause, longer this time, the space between them stretching in a way that could not be closed by tone alone, and Daniel exhaled softly, the sound controlled but audible. "This is not something you can just walk away from," he said, and Emily looked out the window, watching as a car slowed at the intersection, waiting for the light to change, her expression unchanged. "You already did," she replied, and the words landed without emphasis, without accusation, just a simple statement of fact, and for the first time, Daniel did not respond immediately, the silence extending just long enough to shift the balance of the conversation, and when he spoke again, his tone had changed, less certain, more deliberate. "You do not understand the situation," he said, and Emily reached for her cup, lifting it slowly, taking a small sip. Before setting it back down, her movements calm, controlled. "No," she said quietly, "you do not understand it." And there was something final in the way she said it, not raised, not sharp, just clear, and Daniel's voice tightened slightly. "Emily," he began, but she did not let him continue. "You signed everything," she said, her tone still even, her gaze steady. "You just never read it carefully." And this time the silence was different. Not just a pause, but a break, a moment where something shifted on his end of the line, where certainty gave way to recognition, even if it was not fully formed yet. And Emily did not fill that silence, she let it exist, let it expand, because she understood now that the weight of it did more than any explanation could. And when Daniel finally spoke again, his voice was quieter, more controlled than before. "We will handle this properly," he said, and Emily nodded once, though he could not see it. "We will," she agreed, and then she ended the call. Not abruptly, not dramatically, just a simple, deliberate action that closed the conversation exactly where she intended it to end. And she placed the phone back on the table, her expression unchanged, her posture steady, and across from her, her son stirred slightly, his small hand moving against the fabric of the blanket, and she adjusted it again with careful precision, her attention returning fully to him, because everything else had already been set into motion. And outside, the traffic light turned green, cars moving forward in a steady line, the city continuing its rhythm without interruption, unaware that somewhere within it, a conversation had just taken place that Daniel Carter would not fully understand until it was far too late. Daniel chose the setting carefully, a conference room on the 32nd floor of a glass building downtown, the kind of place designed to signal control, where polished surfaces and clean lines made everything feel deliberate, contained. And he arrived early, sitting at the head of the long table with a folder in front of him, his phone placed precisely to the right, his posture relaxed but calculated, as if the environment itself would reinforce the outcome he expected. And when the door finally opened, Emily stepped in without hesitation, her pace steady, her expression unchanged, the baby secured against her chest, wrapped neatly, quiet. And for a brief second Daniel's eyes moved to the child, not lingering, not softening, just acknowledging something he had not fully accounted for. And then he stood, offering a controlled nod instead of a greeting. "Emily," he said, and she took a seat across from him without responding to his tone, without adjusting to his pace, simply placing herself exactly where she intended to be, and the room settled into a silence that felt structured rather than uncertain. And Daniel began first, opening the folder, sliding a set of documents across the table. "We can handle this cleanly," he said, his voice even, practiced. "There is no need to complicate things." And Emily looked at the papers but did not reach for them immediately, her attention shifting briefly to her son as he moved slightly, her hand adjusting the edge of the blanket with precise care before she finally lifted her gaze back to Daniel. "You have already complicated it," she said quietly. And the statement landed without resistance, not confrontational, just accurate. And Daniel exhaled once, controlling the shift in his expression. "You are overestimating your position," he replied, and this time Emily did reach for the documents, not to review them, but to align them neatly in front of her, her fingers smoothing the edges as if organizing something that had already been decided, and then she opened her own folder, placing a single document on the table between them, sliding it forward with the same calm precision, and Daniel glanced at it briefly, his expression unchanged at first, then more focused as he recognized the format, the language, the signatures, and the room grew quieter, the kind of silence that carried weight rather than absence, and Emily spoke again, her voice steady. "You signed this 2 years ago," she said, and Daniel's gaze moved across the page more carefully now, his confidence adjusting, not collapsing, but recalibrating as he read, and she continued, "You said it was standard, that it did not change anything," and she paused just long enough for him to reach the section that mattered, the clause written clearly, without ambiguity, outlining control, ownership, decisions that extended beyond what he had assumed, and Daniel leaned back slightly, not reacting outwardly, but the shift was there, subtle but real, and Emily did not press, did not explain further. She allowed the document to speak in the way it had always been designed to, and after a moment, Daniel placed the paper down, his fingers resting lightly against the table. "This is not how this works," he said, and Emily met his gaze without hesitation. "It is exactly how it works," she replied, and there was no edge in her tone, no emphasis, just clarity, and the balance in the room shifted, not dramatically, not suddenly, but in a way that could not be reversed, and Daniel looked at the child again, this time longer, his expression harder to read, less certain, and Emily followed that glance, her hand resting lightly against her son's back, her posture unchanged. "You called him a mistake," she said, her voice still even. "But you built everything around him without realizing it." And the words settled into the space between them, not as accusation, but as conclusion, and Daniel did not respond immediately. His silence no longer controlled in the same way it had been before, and Emily closed her folder, the soft sound marking the end of the discussion more clearly than anything else could, and she stood, adjusting the carrier with careful precision, her movements unhurried, and when she spoke again, it was not to argue, not to negotiate, but to define what had already been set. "We will handle this properly," she said, repeating his words back to him without changing their meaning, and she turned toward the door, pausing only once, not to look back at him, but to adjust the blanket around her son one more time, ensuring it sat exactly as it should, and then she left the room, the door closing quietly behind her, and Daniel remained where he was, the document still on the table, the realization settling in slowly, not all at once but in layers, and for the first time the situation was no longer something he could control by speaking, by deciding, by walking away, because what he had dismissed in a single sentence had already become something far more permanent, something structured, something that would unfold with or without him. And in the hallway outside, Emily walked forward without hesitation, her pace steady, her expression calm, and the child against her chest remained quiet. His presence constant, no longer something questioned, no longer something denied, but something that had already proven its place in a way Daniel Carter could no longer ignore.